As long as everybody can hear me, let me know if you can't. What I want to talk to you about this evening is one particular Roman campaign. It's recorded for us by Tacitus in his book, the Agricola, and it's most famous for the fact that at the end of it, he defeated the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius. What I want to do is to try to put some flesh on the bare bones of Tacitus' description. Oh, now it won't move on. There we go. Sorry. In his description of this campaign, Tacitus says that Agricola's army marched light. It's without its impedimenta, and we would normally translate that as marching light. And there's a problem, of course, in what this meant. I mean, we know from other armies in these circumstances, like Alexander's, that they got rid of all the non-combatants, they set fire to surplus baggage and so on. We don't know any of that in this case. We just know that it marched light. One of the other problems is that we don't know whether or not this is simply a topos, a favorite phrase used by Roman writers to record what the good general should do. It's just a phrase which occurs time and time again, which we have to be careful to consider in the round. So, for example, Tacitus says that Agricola put many things to right as governor of Britain, but his predecessor was Frontinus, a pillar of rectitude. And we shouldn't take seriously that Agricola came to a province which was bureaucratically mad and sorted out all the issues. It's just a topos. Similarly, we're told that Agricola chose the sites of the camps and forts himself. Really? It may be, but that's what everything was said about a good general. So we're at slightly difficult grounds in assuming that this was reality, this statement of actual reality, rather than just was the choice phrase. Excuse me. When we are trying to think about Roman campaigns, one of the best sources is Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. I found in using this, I need to read it several times. You read it with campaigning in mind, you read it with supplies in mind, you read it with fighting in mind, and get more out of it that way. And Caesar tells us about how the Roman army collected its supplies, where it went for winter quarters and so on. It's an invaluable source, and it's one of course, several, including Tacitus's other works and various Roman books, as Pseudo-Hyginus's book on castramentation and Vegetius. But for a campaign, Caesar's wonderful. Another important and entirely different source of information is Trajan's column, which you see here in Rome. And this records the fighting of Trajan's two wars against the Dacians fought between 101 and 106. And I'm going to use this quite a lot because it makes a point of what I want to talk about. So let's start out. What can we tell about the army commanded by Julius Agricola? Well, it included legionaries, and here they are on Trajan's column, marching out, not completely clad in their full uniforms. They're going out over a bridge of boats from an archway, presumably from a town or a legionary fortress. And if we come and look at them slightly closer, we see that over their shoulder, each man is carrying a pole with a pan attached to it and a string bag and a patterer and so on. So then we'll come back to this, what they're carrying. The funny thing, round thing over their shoulder is actually their helmet. And at the head of all these soldiers is, in the middle here, the commanding officer, and he's leading the standard bearers, the eagle of the legion, the boar, or whatever it was in this particular case, which was a legionary symbol, and the standards of the centuries, as well as the legionary flag. The other part, important part of Agricola's army was his auxiliaries. Here we see one fighting the Dacians. In his right hand, he would have had a spear, which had long gone from the column, which he was thrusting at the man below him. Of course, not all auxiliaries were dressed like that. Here we have a slinger. Whether there were slingers in Agricola's army, we do not know, but they were certainly there in Trajan's army just 20 years later. And cavalry. The cavalry usually came from the allies of Rome. The Roman army was primarily infantry-based and brought with them Gallic and Spanish and sometimes British cavalry, of course, with them to fight at Mons Graupius. What's also important is that Tacitus, in relationship to Agricola's final two campaigns, mentioned the navy. This was really part of the army, but it was there on his campaigns, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. So that's the main force: heavy infantry, the legionaries, auxiliary infantry and cavalry, and the navy. It's not all that easy to pin down the exact size of Agricola's army. There appeared to be 8,000 auxiliary infantry who took the brunt of the fighting, 5,000 cavalry, which is putting together two statements about cavalry in separate parts in the account of Mons Graupius, and possibly as many as 8,000 legionaries. That's less than 2 legions. Now we know at this time that soldiers from the British legions were away on the continent fighting in Domitian's wars against the Catti. So poor old Agricola is not even left with his whole army to go and fight the Caledonians. So that seems to be about it, just over 20,000 men. So when we Romans, that is, start a campaign, they seek the support of the gods. This is the Bridge distance slab from the Antonine Wall. It's 60 years later, but the message is still the same. Roman cavalrymen riding down a group of Caledonians to the left, and to the right, we have sacrifices to the gods, presumably at the start or the preparations for the campaign. This stone recalls Legion 2, which you can see on the third line on the left, and also on the flag behind the priests and officers. And making the sacrifice is the commanding officer. We know his name, Claudius Carax. He came from Pergamon in modern Turkey, and he's pouring a libation onto the altar while the 3 different animals wait in turn to be sacrificed to the gods. So this is very important, and it's not that different in many ways from what happens today before and after campaigning, where armies seek the support of their gods in the battle to come. We know something, of course, as well about where Agricola marched. This is a map of all known marching camps dating to the governorship of Agricola, and there's quite a lot in southern Scotland indicating an easterly route up from Tyne through along the road which became known as Deer Street, the A68, to Newstead and on to Lochlands on the Forth, and presumably also a route up the west side of the country as well. And from the Forth, Dunblane and Malling, the camps lead on along the edge of the highlands and round this point here where the highlands almost reach the sea, and then cutting across back along the northeast edge of the highlands, heading towards the Moray Firth. So these camps seem to indicate the route north of the Forth taken in Agricola's final 2 campaigns. We'll come back to this map. What I want to touch on are some of the problems associated with the map. Agricola in his final 2 campaigns is recorded as sending his fleet to reconnoitre the harbours. He pushed the war forward simultaneously by land and sea. Men from the infantry, cavalry and navy were often in the same camp, sharing supplies and high spirits. I don't think this was high archaeological spirits, it was the esprit de corps. And finally, he sent the fleet ahead to plunder in order to spread panic. The army marched light. Now, when we come to look at this map of the camps, the great problem is, with the exception of Dun up on the northeast coast near modern Montrose, here, there are no camps actually along the coast of northern Scotland. So where is it that the soldiers, the cavalry and the infantry, together with the navy, exchange supplies and high spirits in camps which must have been close to the coast, but have not been found? It remains a problem of Agricola's campaigns. So coming back to our soldiers as they marched light, we have several sources on the amount of food each soldier would carry. They range from 3 days rations to 17 or perhaps even more days rations. But whether they carried them themselves or they were taken in the baggage train is another matter. But we might assume if the army was marching light, it had at least 3 days rations with them. We have 2 sources as well, which tell us what each soldier would also carry. Not a field marshal's baton, I assure you, but one states a basket, saw, axe, pick, rope, sickle, and chain, and another cooking pot, mess tin, string bag, and leather bag. So, I mean, these might, well, like the leather bag, carry food, others, items for cooking with, perhaps string bag for carrying forage for making fires. But there's all adds up to quite a significant number of items which each soldier was supposed to be carrying. Now, the question is, how much did they carry themselves? We see, for example, on Trajan's column, ox carts in the foreground and to the right, mule carts pulled by mules, and they're carrying barrels of whatever, water, grain perhaps. So on the column, we can see various animals carrying tents. 3,000 would be required for Agricola's army, weapons, and cooking equipment. Here's a mule carrying cooking equipment. So we have a picture of an army marching normally with a chain of ox carts and mule carts and individual mules carrying the items which the individual soldiers required for themselves. That's the army. That's the military element. What we also have knowledge of from Caesar, from practically every account of any warfare at all, was camp followers. Caesar's army was accompanied by camp followers. He states this on several occasions. He kept them outside the camp unless the going got rough, when they were allowed inside. This was very sensible, because in the 2nd century BC, when Scipio took over the army in Spain, there are 5 different anecdotes, though possibly from the same source originally, which record that he threw out no less than 2,000 prostitutes from the army camps he took over. So we got camp followers. Josephus interestingly stated that the soldiers' servants looked after the soldiers' baggage. So we've got soldiers' servants to include in the camp followers, and the baggage. As I mentioned earlier, Alexander, as he was marching eastwards, on one particular occasion, it is recorded he got rid of the baggage, or as much as he could. But even so, soldiers had baggage, and possibly this included booty, which they collected en route. And finally, is another group of people who accompanied the army, at least on the return trip, because we're told that Agricola took hostages from the tribes he conquered. So when we're looking at the army on the march, we should actually be perhaps thinking of people like this, soldier servants, the women folk of soldiers and servants, and possibly even children going with their parents. Supplies are crucially important, of course. We all remember Napoleon's dictum, "An army marches on its stomach." There are 3 ways you can acquire supplies. You carry them with your army, you're supplied by sea, or you gather them en route. Well, we've touched on supplied by sea and haven't found any evidence apart from Tacitus's statements about that, and we're back to, are these just topoi which are being thrown at us? Carried with the army, interesting. So here we've got an ox cart and a mule cart. However, soldiers and animals could only carry supplies for 10 days, after which it simply becomes counterproductive to carry more because of the logistics. The animals couldn't, you would need more and more mules to carry more and more supplies, for example. Caesar specifically states that in certain times he arranged for supplies to be gathered at towns to which he was marching so that he could collect them there. That's useful to know, but whether this operated in northern Scotland is another matter. He was in different territory. We've touched on, again, supplied by sea, and have our problems with trying to understand Tacitus's account. So we come to collecting food during the campaign, basically stealing it from other people's fields. Caesar again touches on this in one of his campaigns in Britain. He sent his soldiers out to forage, and they were attacked by local people, not surprisingly, perhaps. But grain doesn't germinate overnight. So whatever wheat wood was collected, would be required to be collected later in the season. The Roman season of campaigning usually started in May. We'll come back to this. So in the early days of campaigning, there wouldn't be much food to collect unless you raided local farms. And that's recorded too. Now you might think there wouldn't be much food anyway in Scotland, or at least much wheat. But this map shows broadly the distribution of Iron Age population in the lands north of the Tyne Solway. And the darker shading, of course, is where more people lived. If we come right up into this area, which is modern Deeside, we will learn that here there had been cereal cultivation in progress for towards 4,000 years before the Romans got here. This is a fragment of wheat pericarp, just to remind us of this. So the Romans would be marching through a farm landscape, perhaps not much different from today, where food would be stored for the winter, and all they had to do was stop and burn a few farms and collect food from them. Well, what about the speed of this march? Bearing in mind also the need to carry quite a lot in the way of supplies. Mules can work for 8 hours a day. That's the length of a day for the army in effect. Oxen can work no more than 5 hours at a go and require a break of 2 hours at midday. So well, we're looking at 10 hours for them. And oxen travel at about 3 kilometers per hour on a level road. That's something like 15 kilometers a day. So that's how much the army could march in a single day, somewhere around 15 kilometers. When you think of an army of something like just over 20,000 men, with their baggage, servants, camp followers, marching light, whatever that meant, it still left you something like 15 kilometers between each of these camps. Some are closer than others, which might lead us to believe that the journeys that day were short. We can only guess. But the train of soldiers was so long that in some cases, the vanguard was marching to the position of the next camp, or almost, or possibly even there, while the rear guard was actually leaving the last camp. These camps that you're seeing on the map were quite large. This is one that Professor St. Joseph argued at Durno that the Roman army gathered as the base for its battle of Mons Graupius. I'm not at all sure of that because the topography doesn't quite fit. But we know something about how the camps were laid out. They were laid out according to a relatively rigid plan so that anybody who, soldiers who arrived would know exactly where within the camp to go. It's rather like a brand of modern hotels, which are all built to the same pattern. So if you get lost at night, you can work out where your room is. So this is one of the two basic descriptions of a Roman camp and helps us understand how the soldiers fitted in to this space. So we're coming to the end of our day. This group of soldiers on Trajan's column is marching in two columns. Legionaries at the top, headed by an officer, and down below a group of auxiliaries in various types of auxiliaries. Syrian archers at the front, clubmen behind, and Apsonry auxiliaries at the back. And they're marching during the day to get to their camp that evening. The vanguard is already there. As you can see, it's unloading the tents at the top, off the mule, in this case, off the mule cart. And the soldier bottom right has gone down to the local stream to fill his can with water for the brew. Here again, we've got barrels being loaded. We've seen the barrels on the march before, but here they are being unloaded within the camp, where tents, and it looks as though their tents for officers had been erected to the right, with just in front of those, the type of defensive gate known as the clavicular, which is common in first century camps in northern Scotland. Here again is a camp. You've got to remember artistic license, but we've got another clavicular to the sort of center left, which is opening internally in this case. And to the right, we have these officers and perhaps in the front, soldiers' tents as well. It is interesting that the clavicular is shown in one opening inwards and the other opening outwards, because in Scotland we have found that the clavicular where they open both ways. So here we are. Here's our map again. And the question I want to pose now is how long each camp was occupied. Probably not just for one night. There's an interesting Byzantine source which suggests that by 3 days or nights in one camp, the local grazing and forage would be exhausted. And by forage, I also include firewood. Soldiers needed firewood for their fires to cook their food. And the water supply will be fouled by the horses and the men. To 20,000 or more soldiers in Agricola's army. Quite a lot of mess would result from that. So perhaps we should be looking at something like minimum of 3 days in each camp, with the soldiers collecting firewood, collecting wheat, as you see to the left. Here we are, apparently cutting down trees, not very helpful for fires because it will be green, but it's just to give us the idea of what the soldiers might have been doing. And if they were in hostile territory and they wanted to bring the enemy to heel, either by treaty or by fighting, well, you go out and burn the odd village, as we see on Trajan's column, and we also see on the later column of Marcus still standing in Rome. What happened if the Roman army came under attack? Well, we know that it did in Agricola. In his 6th season, he divided his force into 3. This is perhaps not a bad idea. That form of organization of an army occurs elsewhere. And it does mean if you pitch your camps close to each other, as seems to have happened in this case, you're not trying to collect grain from the same area for wood or mess up your water supply, but you're close enough to help each other if necessary. And of course, this is what happened in Agricola's 6th season when the 9th Legion was attacked in the camp at night, and the Caledonians even got into the camp before Agricola was able to bring up reinforcements and throw them out. If Agricola had lost the 9th Legion, what a different story his governorship would have been. We would probably never have heard of it. But in this depiction, we've got nice tartan trews, for example, and we've got the Caledonian carnix being blown to frighten the Romans. So we're looking at all these counts we're considering at least 3 days in each. We are still, I think, slightly short of, or slightly too endowed, perhaps, with time. Of course, we don't know where Agricola's army started. When he went into winter quarters, where was that? Was it down in Brigantian territory, perhaps safer areas? Caesar often moved his army at winter into friendly territory where he could be supplied, but locally. So it may be that the army has to march up from somewhere around Chester and York to get into the beginning of their campaigning up through southern Scotland and then beyond the Forth. And we don't know when they started. We know that the campaigning season usually started in May, and that's about as far as we can go. So the army's got to gather its forces, supplies, march up to the Forth to start its main campaign, and presumably arrange for supplies to be moved up the coast. Because you see, we've got the camps here by modern Falkirk in the centre, which are very close to the Firth of Forth, and the later fort there was described by Tim Tatton Brown as a sort of bridgehead fort where supplies could be brought in. So it may be that that was a point where the army was resupplied before marching north from that point. But we still don't have enough marching camps and indeed numbers of days at each to fill a whole campaigning season from June or July through to September. Now, a little word or two on Mons Graupius. We know it started with the Caledonians running up and down the field in front of the Roman army in their chariots, an outmoded form of military action by this time, apart from in Britain. But there it is recorded. And then into action came the Roman cavalry, the auxiliary, fighting as we see here. Again, his spear in his right hand has gone, but he's thrusting that at his enemy. And you can see the shield being used as a weapon. And I put this one on as well to show that the legionaries did the same down at the very bottom, middle left. A legionary is using his larger shield as a weapon against his foe in this particular instance. So the battle was won, of course. The legionaries didn't even need to come into the fighting. It was won by the auxiliaries. Where was it fought? Well, we don't know. And a lot of ink has been spilt on the possible locations. If you forgive me, I'm not sure which, yeah, here we go. The known camps come right the way around to the Moray Firth. So the last known marching camp is about where my marker is. But of course, there may be more yet to be discovered further on. But what is very interesting, very close to just a few kilometers from that position, is the site of the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And we might ask why the Battle of Culloden was fought there in particular. And it's very straightforward. If Bonnie Prince Charlie's army had retreated any further, it would have simply dissipated. One group would have gone northwards into the far north of Scotland. One would slip through the glens to the west, to the west coast and the islands, and another would drift down the Great Glen towards the southern Highlands, southern Hebrides. The army would disappear. And it may be that that consideration governed the choice by Calgacus, the commander of the Caledonian force, and his allies to choose a battle site somewhere in the vicinity of Culloden. One day we may find it, but not yet. The season, said Tacitus, was well advanced. So Agricola marched leisurely back to winter quarters. We don't know where he marched. He could have gone along the same route around the east side. It's not impossible that he marched up the Spey and through the highlands in that way, partly because we know of Roman place names along the Spey Valley. And he sent his admiral to circumnavigate Britain. Tacitus is very cheeky. He says that this was the first time it was being done, which was not true. We're back to a sleight of hand in favor of Agricola. Orkney was cited, and Orkney is named, and it is said that Thule was also cited. Now, we don't know where Thule was. The original Thule, as it were, recorded by Pytheas in sometime around 323 BC, was 6 days sailing north of Britain at a place where in winter every day was full of night, and in the summer there was daylight all the day. Just beyond this was the frozen sea, very informative, and where there was a sort of sea lung. This has been interpreted as the spray thrown up by crashing waves. And those Greek writers who were interested in astronomy and the like recognized that Thule was somewhere on the Arctic Circle, well north of Scotland. And I think that probably what happened is that the British fleet sighted some islands to the north of Orkney, and they decided to call them Thule. They'd seen something beyond what they knew was Orkney, and that was Thule. I doubt if it was. It's unlikely even to be Shetland. I used to sail that route regularly, and once went up on deck to ask the captain if you could see Shetland from Orkney, and you can't. It could have been Fair Isle, but that's just a dot on the horizon. And it's perfectly possible if you sail around Orkney and between the Orkney Islands, I did many times, and you look out to the north, you see low-lying islands on the horizon, the northern Orkneys, and it may be that's what was sighted. We simply don't know, but I doubt if they actually saw Shetland. They saw some land which they understood were the furthermost point, and the furthermost point in the north that they knew of was Thule, so it came to be called Thule. So, what can we say? The battle of Mons Graupius was fought late in the season, but we don't know what Agricola did between May and September. It seems several months, longer than was required to march even up from the Tyne-Solway line or further south up to the north east of Scotland to fight the battle. So perhaps they spent quite some time in each camp trying to quell the locals before they actually ended up bringing them to battle at Mons Graupius. Why did he march light? I haven't the vaguest idea. He clearly wanted to finish off the campaigning that season. He'd already been there for 6 seasons. This, we know, was his last season in Britain, and he must have guessed it would be. And he may simply have wanted to make sure that he achieved success without being encumbered by lots of impedimenta. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. It was Very interesting. It's always great when you start thinking about the logistics behind moving everyone around. You sort of think, oh yes, the Roman army went here and here and here. And when you get down to thinking about the logistics, you suddenly realize how huge it must have been to move anything around, keep them supplied and get anywhere. So we have about 15 minutes of questions. So just to reiterate to those of us, those who are watching, if you'd like to ask a question, there is the little questions and answer box at the bottom. It's denoted by the 2 speech bubbles there. If you type your question into it, we can answer them. So I have one in the box already. So a question from Robert Pitts asking if the length of the day at that time of year would have had any bearing on the campaign.
That's a good question. The days are still longer. I don't know where the questioner lives, but I live in Edinburgh and it's still like now at 10 o'clock at night and afterwards. Of course, you come down, I'm now in Peterborough, and the day's shorter. But so the further north you go, the longer his daylight would be available to Agricola, which is quite interesting and think of in those days. So I doubt if it made much difference. And this is largely because you can only move at the speed of your baggage animals. That's it, and a really crucial thing. 2 of the best books are trying to understand animals, armies campaigning before mechanization, books on the Zulu War and on the Boer War, when it's very interesting to see how slow oxen move within the army structure.
Okay, I've got more questions coming in now. One from Samuel Marston. Would the Romans have used more suitable ships for the North Sea like Caesar did with the Veneti Gallic tribe?
Yes, that's a good question. And in spite of the fact that my dad spent 6 years in the Navy during the war, I've never got to grips with the Roman Navy as such. I'm sure that would be the case. I mean, the Romans had got used to the North Sea. The Judo-Claudian princes campaigned right up to the north of Jutland. I'm sorry, I cut that slide out with the map illustrating this. I'm sure that they would have created tough ships for the purpose. We're not told that any ships were lost, but of course, Tacitus may have kept quiet if they had lost ships. We don't know that even, do we? Yeah, I'm sure you're right. They would have got ships for the appropriate for the occasion. And it's interesting again that there's no reference to the ships carrying supplies. Do we just have to understand that?
Yes, maybe it's one of those things that perhaps it goes without saying that there were ships and supplies. Yeah.
You see, Tacitus is writing a hagiography of his father-in-law. One of my favorite moments was when Peter J., who was then our ambassador in America, described his father-in-law, James Callahan, as a second Moses. Truly, so you've got to take with a pinch of salt what a bloke's saying about his father-in-law.
Yes. Okay, question from Sally Blandford. Would the Roman Navy have used rivers as far as they were navigable for supply purposes as well as coastal harbours?
Yeah, I'm sure that will be the case. It's interesting that very many fortresses and forts were placed on rivers, and especially on river mouths or the mouths of tributaries. So if you just think in terms of Inverest and Cramond, east of the Antonine Wall, both of them are situated beside tributaries leading into the Forth. You can go up the Danube, down the up the Rhine, I meant to say, and down the Danube, and you find at practically every tributary there's a fort. And it's not just water for drinking, let's say, assuming it was safe, but it's because you could pull your ships out of the main tidal thrust or flow of the river upstream out of that flow and protect them. So rivers are very important to the Roman army in how they located their forts.
Another question here from Kelvin van Nuffel. Would it be a possibility that the army went ahead with mules in order to travel faster and the oxen catch up at a later phase to resupply them, and in doing so making it possible to get further in a day than marching together with the oxen?
Yeah, of course that is possible. The trader's column shows, as we've seen, ox carts and mule carts together. You do cut, you have, I mean, even the Roman army has to be careful at getting guerrilla attacks. If you divide up your army too thinly, you could find that parts of it were picked off. So I think that might be really rather dangerous. And it's reinforced by, of course, what happened in the 6th season when the 9th Legion was attacked in the camp.
Sorry, I've got more questions coming in now, coming in faster than I can see them. There's one here from Lindsay Powell. She's making the comment, is our basic problem that the source is Tacitus? He obviously listened to Agricola's war stories, but was not himself a military man and often got details of campaigns wrong. So as military historians today, we crave the details he glossed over, but is he himself the problem?
Yeah, I think, of course, he is. I mean, there are only 7 place names in the Agricola. And some of those we don't even know where they were. So we do have problems. He's writing his history for the ruling class in Rome, or the ruling class of the Roman Empire, not necessarily all in Rome itself. And you've got to remember that. Yeah, I wouldn't say he didn't have any military experience. He did serve in the Imperial Civil Service. But yes, you can just see, can't you? Agricola getting out the salt and pepper pots and describing how Mons Graupius was fought time and time again till he became a boring old so-and-so. Yeah, I absolutely. It really just comes back as well to the fact that this is about hagiography about his father-in-law.
Okay. Right. Back to the Roman oxen now. So Susan Rands has said depictions of Roman ox carts tend to show only 2 oxen. Have you seen any evidence of teams of more than 2?
Can I pass on that one? I don't think I have on Trainer's column. I would have to say that the pictures that you've been seeing were actually taken by me and a professional photographer friend in 1985 when it was covered in scaffolding, and I got permission to go up the scaffolding and take photographs. And that's what you're looking at. So there are a lot of photographs I couldn't take because they were shrouded in scaffolding at the time. But I'll go back and have a look.
What else have we got? There's one from Susan Biddle here. Could the marching light be a result perhaps of experience in earlier campaigns? For example, if slowed down by excessive baggage train or hangers-on or the weather or frequent harassment by locals, if it wasn't an issue in the last campaign, could it be an example of frequent occurrence of tactics directed by what happened in a previous campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. In the campaign up to the River Tay, Firth and Clyde, that area, basically Tacitus says it was such a walkover for Agricola that he even had time to build forts. Forts are usually not built until the enemy was defeated and sorted. That's interesting in itself. When we come on to the next season, he got well, not the next season, but next season, but 2. He must have had a big shock with the night attack on the 9th. The Caledonians are clearly a force to be reckoned with. Tacitus also says that they attacked a fort, and this was an excuse for Agricola to march against them. The Romans always liked a decent cause, belly, so he had two shocks. The fort within the province, it would appear, was attacked, and then his camp was attacked, the 6th season. So you could well believe that he wanted a compact army without any encumbrances to make sure that the job was completed.
Okay. Another question from Delwyn Matthews this time. Did Agricola first consider invading Ireland while he was campaigning in Scotland?
Yes, Tacitus says this. And Agricola said that he thought that Ireland could be conquered by a legion and a few auxiliaries, which does seem rather unlikely. But John Mann said this was just a topos. It was just what had been said in other circumstances. Interestingly, at the same time, Tacitus said that we knew a lot about the interior of the country through merchants and travelers. And indeed we do. If you compare Ptolemy's knowledge about the interior of Ireland with Scotland north of the Great Glen, they knew a lot more about the interior of Ireland. So there was a lot of contact between the Roman province of Britain and Ireland. And there was an available cause insofar as Agricola along the way had picked up an Irish prince who'd fled. And so he could have made an excuse for invasion here to put this chap back on his throne. So there were points in favor of this, but he didn't do it. And you've got to remember that he wasn't a free agent. It depended on what the emperor wanted him to do.
Okay. Question here from Peter Steele. What proportion of the British garrison would Agricola have taken on the Graupius campaign, and what reserves would he have had in Britannia?
That's a good one. The army of invasion was something like 40,000 men. And at this time, it was probably, in theory, not much different. But he had troops from his legions on the continent. That reduced his force. So instead of having 20,000 legionaries with him, it seems he only had 8,000. And you have to be very careful in a recently pacified new province not to commit the same problem as Suetonius Paulinus, who was away campaigning in Anglesey when Boudicca went on the rampage. So you do need troops, as the questioner implied, still in the province. You also have one of the major problems is you've got to take out of your active army clerks, people who run the place, the sick, and accept that whatever the theoretical total of a regiment would have been, it would have been a theoretical total with clear evidence from military Roman documents that armies could be 10% or more below strength. Mm-hmm. So I could, if you want to email me, I'll try to produce an answer. But other than that, I can't produce the figures out off the top of my head.
Okay. Right, I think I have 8 or 9 new questions, so I'm going to ask people to stop sending questions in now because we're running a bit short on time, and we'll see if we can get through these last few. So Rob Nolan has asked, how long would it take to set up a new camp?
Difficult to answer. I mean, every camp was defended by a bank and ditch, and the soldiers or the army carried stakes in which they would plant in the top of the rampart. and the army was well drilled in creating camps. They were trained in this. So it shouldn't have taken that long. Becky Jones will be the best person to answer this one. I'll throw in a random piece of information. Do you know why Isonwanda was lost in the Boer War? It's because Chelmsford, the general, started his campaigning so late in the season because he couldn't collect enough cavalry horses for his army, and therefore he left Isonwanda unprotected by a bank and ditch, which he ought to have dug, but didn't, which is why the Zulu warriors captured it. I mean, they might have captured it anyway, but the crucial point is, in the accounts, it's clear he left it undefended. So you do need to defend, and it would, I don't know, it shouldn't have taken you that long with so many men available.
Okay. Question here from Samuel Marston. They've found evidence of trade with the locals, farmsteads with Roman coins in Low Scotland. They've also found some evidence of hill forts or villages under siege. Do you think it was more of a hearts and minds campaign, or were they more interested in pillaging the local land to supply the troops?
I don't think, I think in Scotland there is no evidence for sieges. That's very straightforward. I think if we want to understand what's happening, we've got to get ourselves into the minds of the Romans. Virgil said, you, O Romans, have been given the task of ruling the world, something like that. Think of white men. I mean, just at this present time, think especially of white men in the 18th and 19th centuries. The world was theirs to rule. Practically every country in Europe was invaded and parts of it taken over by white men. So think of the Romans like that. Theirs was the world to take. And that's, it would appear, what they were setting out to do. Whether they had a very clear idea of the size of Britain. They knew that the number of Orkney Islands, they said there were 30. There were actually 60, but in the 1911 census, there were only 30 inhabited Orkney Islands, which I've always thought is a nice coincidence. They knew of the Outer Hebrides, they knew of Shetland, which they gave it a name. So all of this was known before Agricola even got here. They had some idea of the geographical scale of the issue, is the point I'm making. And with that in mind, and what I said about how they saw the world, we could see their aim as being simply taking over the rest of the island. You've got to remember, it took them 200 years to conquer Spain. They didn't, if you start out from the same date, from the date 43, with the conquest of Britain, it would have taken them until 243 perhaps to conquer Britain. And of course, by then it was a different Roman world with civil war and invasion. So they didn't get that far. But presumably what's in their minds is not just pillaging. They wanted to take people into the empire, and they would take people into the empire if they submitted. If they didn't submit, fighting would ensue until they did submit. And the best guess is still that Caesar killed 1 million Gauls before he got them to completely surrender. 1 million. So I don't think it's pillaging. It's this almost messianic view of the gift of the gods was the rule of the world for the Romans.
Right.
I'm just going to switch a light on.
Okay, yeah.
I started out, it was daylight. I seem to be disappearing from my own screen. Right.
Okay, a question regarding the cooking pots that soldiers carried with them.
Yeah.
A question from Carmen Sanchez, who would like to ask if they were commonly pottery or metal made. Were they likely to be local or brought with them from wherever they came from? And is there any study on their cooking equipment?
Yes, I can't name them offhand. I tend to be a structures person, not a finds person, unfortunately. Yes, they're metal cooking pots. There were makers of cooking pots, and they stamped their wares, so we know this, and we found some in Scotland, and each soldier would be required to have all the appropriate equipment. Then there's a question of how was this supplied? Did the army supply it? Or could you buy your own? And both seem to have operated. We've got letters saying writing home to mum and dad, can you please send me such and such? Not just the underpants from Vindolanda, but a dagger or a sword. When the soldier died or retired, all this equipment was then sold on, and his heirs or himself, if he was still alive, got the product of the sale. Not answering it fully, sorry, but you'll have to search around for articles. Okay. They do exist.
Okay, question from Mark Corby. Have you compared the speed of Cumberland's army to Culloden in 1746 as a possible guide to Agricola's advance?
That is a good one. Gordon Maxwell looked at routes such as Edward I's army, and of course Mark's right by implication that there would not be a lot of difference. It was pre-mechanization. The answer is no, but thank you, I'll go away and do it.
Sort of following on from that and sticking with the suggestion of Culloden, there's a question here from Andrew Tibbs, who thinks that your suggestion of Culloden as the site of Mons Graupius is very interesting, and can you expand on this?
Not really. I think I've said all that I can say. It's, if you like, is geographical determinism, that brings me to that point. I mean, battles are often fought in particular places for very specific reasons. Napoleon's army marching to Moscow, the Russians tried to stop him at Smolensk, and there's a very specific reason for that. I can't say any more than the fact that here was the point where if you retreat any further, your army just disappears.
Okay. I think this one from Bob Robertson here might be more of a point than a question perhaps, but he said there are no examples of animal teams set up in line in the ancient world as far as he can see. So the 4-horse chariots were 4 horses abreast. So must our conclusion be that the ancients didn't have the technology to harness draft animals in line, therefore that's why they only have 2 rather than 4?
No, I think I'm trying hard to remember if I've seen 4 in line on Trajan's column, and I can't answer you that. Sorry. I mean, Trajan's column is published. Freer and Lepper book has all the pictures in, and there are others. Have fun searching the answers out yourself.
Okay. A question from Jacques Neeling is why march light when you stay for days in one camp? Okay.
I don't know. I've already answered this. I can't answer because we're not told. We're dealing with a conundrum and trying to make the best completed jigsaw, best completed picture we can, knowing that 3/4 of the pieces of the jigsaw are being thrown away.
Mm-hmm. Okay, on to our final question then, one from Susan Biddle. This is going back to the idea of Culloden perhaps being the site for Mons Graupius and the reason for it. And she's asking, to what extent has Culloden been investigated for Roman remains, and is there any prospect for investigation there for battles preceding Culloden?
I don't think Susan Biddle must be a Scot. I mean, I mean, most battle sites, I mean, we can't even be absolutely sure of where Bosworth Field was fought, can we?
I don't think so.
No, I mean, battlefield sites are enormously difficult to locate for certain. I mean, you've got to produce bits of equipment and you've got to be sure they're of the right period and so on. And at Culloden, there is already one battlefield site. So we can work out something from the shot there, which has been found. But I say, in all seriousness, that in relationship to national sentiment, that this is a very serious site to consider as to whether one would ever be allowed to undertake excavations for something like this, not least when the forebears of the Scots lost the Caledonians. I mean, you know, come on. This is a really touchy subject, I think. I mean, I once gave a lecture in Inverness on why did the Romans fail to conquer Scotland. And at the end of this, I had what I can only describe as 35 minutes of vituperative abuse, because I was saying, well, they didn't conquer Scotland because the Romans didn't want to. You know, my audience didn't like that explanation. They prefer to believe that the height of the Scottish mountains put the Romans off, or the ferocity of the people, and so on. And these were the real reasons. In suggesting we dig up Culloden, we're really trespassing into dangerous territory.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we'll finish there. I have no more questions come in. So yes, all that's left to do then is say thank you, David, for a fascinating lecture and for answering the questions this evening. So this was our last lecture of the current Roman Army series of lectures. So if people would like to stay tuned to our website, which is ad43.org.uk, further information about potential future lectures may come up on there. Otherwise, you can follow us on our Facebook pages or our Twitter pages, where we are just at Roman Army School. You should be able to find us quite easily there.
Could I just encourage you to keep your eye on the website? I already have a couple of speakers, one on Roman artillery, and the other guy, Stiebel, who came to Roman Army School, who is going to talk about his latest research at Masada.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So yeah, also it's possible to sign up to our newsletter. You can either do that by emailing us, or there's a way of doing it, contacting us through the website. If you sign up to our newsletter, you'll never miss an online lecture because we publish them all in there with our links to them. If there is nothing else to be said, I think it's about time to bid everyone a good evening. So thank you, David, once again for tonight's lecture. And Ron, if you would like to sign everybody out, we'll say good evening for tonight.